My pleasure this evening to welcome you all to this Cambridge Centre for Geopolitics event and to introduce our speaker, Elbridge Colby. Elbridge is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, which is focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. Last year, he published his book, which we're going to be talking about this evening, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, with Yale University Press. And his central argument is that the United States must prepare to win a war with China. Strategy of Denial featured in the Wall Street Times 10 Best Books of 2021. Elbridge served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 through 2018. And during that time, he led the development of the 2018 National Defense Strategy for the United States, which marked a watershed moment in American strategic thinking. And in a way to frame our discussion this evening, I want to read a little bit just for the first page of that strategy. And that is this: today we are emerging from a period of strategic atrophy, aware that our competitive military advantage has been eroding. We are facing increasing global disorder, characterized by decline in the long-standing rules-based international order, creating a security environment more complex and volatile than any we have experienced in recent memory. Interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern in US national security. We're obviously having this discussion this evening when that global disorder could not be more apparent. The war that began on the 24th of February, though, was not brought about by China, but by Russia. It is then a crucial question whether this war changes the geopolitical threats facing the United States and the West, or whether the United States still needs to keep laser-like attention on China. With that question in mind to frame our discussion, we're going to start with Elbridge talking for 20 minutes about the way in which he sees this moment in time in view of the arguments he's been making about the paramount importance of rivalry with China. I'm going to engage in a conversation with him then for 20 minutes, and we're going to have further 20 minutes of questions from you all, which I will then pose to Elbridge. So it's a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you, Elbridge. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Helen, and thanks for the Cambridge Center for Geopolitics for the invitation. Pleasure to be able to speak with you all this evening, UK time, and only regret it's virtually, but a little bit easier to pull off at this time. But look forward to engaging in person before too long. But thanks, Helen, for the introduction and the sort of description. I think I'll go along with your framing of the question by saying nothing has changed, actually, because this book, it kind of building in my experience of the national defense strategy, but a sort of, I call it kind of my platonic version of it, is a analysis of where the United States needs to focus its energies, and particularly its military preparation, in light of what I'd like to refer to, what the economists, your political economists, call scarcity, right? We don't have enough resources to plausibly cover down on all the threats we may face in the international environment. And this is different when you could at least plausibly have this attitude in 1999 or even 2005. The United States could essentially cover down on all the plausible, tractable, or plausible or realistic challenges it might face, or its alliance network might face, essentially with its own resources. And that's no longer the case. And this is, of course, above all because of the rise of China, which is now an economy that is roughly as large as we are. I mean, metrics differ, of course, but is roughly the size of our own and is growing at a faster rate, at least probably likely to over time. So in this context, how do we think about what we really need to do? My view is that we cannot pretend that we're living in 1999 or 2005. And actually, one of the depressing features of the current environment in the United States, as well as elsewhere, is there's a sort of resurgence of this attitude that was sort of the unipolar moment attitude, without any reckoning with the notion that we no longer have the power base to be able to do that. And this is not a kind of a self-flagellating attitude about the United States. It's just a practical matter. The United States is about 20% of global GDP. China is about the same, but then other, rising economies in the world are a larger and larger proportion. So even if you align America's allies with it, which is an imperfect measure, we no longer have a sort of preponderant power position. So in this context, I think you need a strategy, and a strategy is not a clever plan. A strategy, rather, in my view, is a framework, an intelligent, rational framework for allocating resources, risks, effort, et cetera. And so in this context, we need to go back to first principles as Americans, and what is it our foreign policy for? I don't believe it's for, I did not have the pen on that unclassified summary, hence the use of the term rules-based international order, which I don't like, but because I think it actually obscures what we really need to be focused on. I don't think I ever used it in the book except negatively. But what Americans' foreign policy should fundamentally be about is our security, prosperity, and our freedoms as Americans in an enlightened self-interest way wherever possible, working with others and benefiting others, but fundamentally this kind of enlightened self-interest mindset. In that context, if we look at the international environment, what are the threats that we face? Well, by far the most significant threat we face, and this is a long-standing sort of, if dormant view in American strategic thought, and in some sense builds on the sort of balancing mentality of traditional British strategic approach, which is that we cannot allow any nation or entity, but in practice, any state to become dominant over one of the world's key market sort of areas, essentially a geoeconomic position that would allow it to have a dominant influence over the global economy, because this would allow them to intrude and shape and ultimately undermine our national life and our freedoms. And if we look at the world, it's obviously not evenly distributed economic power and growth and dynamism. It's concentrated in a few areas, especially Europe, of course, North America, Asia, increasingly broad swath of Asia, and then in a relatively narrow way, the Persian Gulf, because of hydrocarbons, essentially. But by far the most important of these is Asia, which is going to be upwards of 50% of global GDP in the future. In the old days, Europe was the decisive theater. It was the center of the global economy. It's not anymore. According to Joseph Borrell, it's going to shrink to about 10% of global GDP in about 20 years. So it doesn't mean that Europe's not important. It's just a lot less important than Asia. If China were able to, if a country were able to dominate Asia, that would give it a power position that would allow it to be dominant in American life, and of course Europe as well by extension. That's not really the case in Europe. And again, I want to underscore that doesn't mean Europe's not important. It just means it's less important in the sense of a priority. And then if we take that point and then we look at which are the most powerful countries in the world, well, it's, other than the United States itself, it's China. So China's located, of course, in Asia, a big part of Asian dynamism. So that means that it's positioned to attain that, what I think of as regional hegemony, which you could in the contemporary world, I think the states and certainly the Chinese understand that direct territorial administration of far-flung, empire is not the most, net beneficial, but rather that a kind of more informal hegemonic situation where they have the benefits of control and sway, sort of setting boundaries and so forth is the optimum. And that's what we need to worry about. And I think it's increasingly clear that the Chinese are pursuing not only regional hegemony, but possibly more from that position, a globally dominant position that would allow them to do the things I'm talking about. And of course, we see them trying this out on, say, the Australians, even over the last few months. So this is the primary goal, and this gives an orienting approach to American foreign policy. So the primary goal of American foreign policy should be to deny China a hegemonic position over Asia, followed by Europe, which is the second most important, other than North America itself, which is largely important because of the United States, and in a more narrow way, the Persian Gulf, which is, but Europe is less of a problem because Russia is, while a significant threat, as we see, is far less powerful than China. And in fact, if anything, we're seeing that it's actually less of a military threat than we might have appreciated. I have been surprised by how poorly their military appears to have performed. We'll see how this plays out. And of course, there's there's far more capability for a balancing coalition, and what I call an anti-hegemonic balancing coalition in Europe, because the European states together are far larger economically and in latent military power than Russia. Contrast that with Asia, where the for a variety of reasons, the Asian states, both because of just pure power metrics, but also because of their dispersed character, find it more difficult to come together in this anti-hegemonic way. So this is how do we stop this from happening? How do we stop China from attaining regional hegemony over the world's largest market area? Well, in my view, an anti-hegemonic coalition, so a traditional balancing coalition. And in fact, this is happening, not particularly through any genius of our own, but largely in reaction to Beijing's behavior. You see AUKUS and the Quad and Japanese, Australian activities to come together. I don't want to exaggerate this. A lot of this has been pretty superficial so far. So one thing, Helen, I would just, flag for that is that this is kind of happening, but very slowly and kind of fitfully and largely at the symbolic level. But this is what we need to drive and focus on. Unfortunately, the Chinese have a way to respond to this if they are sufficiently resolute, which I imagine they are. And that is to use their power to try to break that coalition apart. And, there are a number of ways it can do that. I think of it as a sort of their, I think it's best to think about what their best strategy is. And that's what I call focused and sequential strategy. So rather than precipitating a conflict with an assembled coalition, Hitler style, rather you try to pick off the coalition sort of in sequence and try to collapse or short circuit it. And China, I think, is kind of trying to do this with its economic situation. I think it's actually finding it difficult to do so. Unsurprisingly, I think economic sanctions tend to be limited in their utility for sort of what you might think of as grand coercion. But so that's good news. But the bad news is China also has a military instrument to pursue that, an increasingly powerful PLA. In fact, they're announcing their open sources saying that they're going to increase spending yet again by 7%. So, China's already nearing American levels of defense spending, depending on how you measure it. Some people think they've already surpassed us. It's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not crazy. And they are laser focused on the Pacific. They're focused on us. They have the advantages of proximity and interior lines, whereas we have to project power across the Pacific, et cetera. So this is the problem. And just briefly, in order to defeat China's ability or deny China's ability, hence the title of the book, to break apart the coalition through this employment of military force, through this focused and sequential strategy, I believe that we need a denial defense, a military denial defense. And this is basically a relative standard that is basically that we need to be able to defend our allies. And from a defense planning point of view, I include Taiwan in that context, sufficient to deny China's ability to subordinate them. So again, that's a relative standard depending on how sort of doughty and resolute the vulnerable ally is. Britain of 1940 was different than Belgium of 1940. That has significant implications. But basically, in simple terms, it's to deny the ability of the People's Liberation Army to seize and hold the key territory of a U.S. ally. And of course, if we can get Taiwan right, then we can get basically most of our allies right. South Korea is a little bit different, but Japan, Philippines, Australia, et cetera, will be good. And then in that context, the anti-hegemonic coalition will cohere and operate, and I think we'll have stability. So, you said, Helen, that my book is about preparing for war with China. Well, the purpose of the purpose of it is to prepare for war with China, to avoid that conflict by demonstrating to China that it would fail in its goals if it resorted to this kind of approach. Just to kind of tie it back to what's happening today, nothing in my view has changed. And I think this is the real sort of where the rubber meets the road in American defense strategy and allied, by extension, allied defense planning, is that denial is a high standard militarily, given the resources that China can bring to bear. So if we pursue, let's put it in the context of the United Kingdom, if we had said, yeah, we're never going to come over and help, protect UK and in addition to its own efforts, or push the Germans out of France and so forth in the Low Countries, but instead we're going to, sink German shipping and impose a distant blockade. That's a different question for if you're, a vulnerable ally, and I don't think that's sufficient. Instead, what we're going to need is the ability to get into the teeth of the Chinese military machine and block, not exert dominance over China, not invade China or something like that, but block China from projecting power, 100 miles off its coast. So that's a high standard. I think that we're not, one thing I would quibble with your opening statement, Helen, is that you said that we should keep the focus on Asia. We haven't actually executed the shift to Asia. So we've talked about it somewhat. But as I think actually a lot of our elite is showing right now, is that a lot of people who were talking about it kind of, sort of, don't actually really believe it. And they didn't. And this is why we've, people are saying all over the place, ranging from the John Boltons of the world. So, a bit of an eye roll from me, but to, many others are saying, we can't afford to focus on Asia. We have to do Asia and Europe and the Middle East. And this is a fantasy, because we don't have the power base to do it. China alone is a large economy as we are. And of course, the Russians are also a threat. And we haven't even mentioned Iran, North Korea, terrorism, Cuba, Venezuela, the list could go on, right? And, China could, first of all, it's not clear to me that we're going to be prepared to increase defense spending, but even if it did, whether we would spend it efficiently or wisely. And of course, the Chinese could match increases. They actually have a smaller defense burden on their economy than we do. So what I think we should do in Europe, I actually laid it out at the end of the book in the penultimate chapter, which is actually even a worse scenario than we're facing today. I envisioned a Russian attack into NATO. And my view is that the United States doesn't have the resources to play a predominant role for its allies in both theaters, and it needs to do that more in Asia. It should stay committed to NATO, support NATO, but the Europeans are going to have to take the primary role in the conventional defense of European NATO, and by extension, possibly the partners like Sweden and Finland. And that's well within the economic capacity. The United States should help and should help transition to that. But I'm very concerned that where we're going now is an overemphasis on Europe, which is in a sense the comfort zone of a lot of the American elite. The problem is I don't think this is good, certainly for the United States, but I actually don't think it's good for Europe either, because nothing about China has changed in the last month. I mean, if anything, maybe they're even worse because they're backing a brutal invasion of Ukraine, and they seem to be doing that and not changing their policy. And if we double down in Europe in a way that prevents us from increasing our prioritization in Asia, we are essentially on a trajectory to become very vulnerable and ultimately, I would say court defeat. So that's the situation that we face. And if that happens, then at some point in the future, we will be forced to shift radically to Asia. And the example I like to use, maybe it's imperfect, but it's the best one I could think of, is the British decision in the East of Suez decision in 1967. I'm sure, Helen, you know much more about this than I do, but my understanding is, kind of from one day to the next, London decided they could no longer back up their long promised security guarantees to the Gulf monarchies because of, sort of economic constraints. So it's a little bit different in the sense that what I'm talking about here is more geopolitical, but it relates to economic constraints. So just because we say we're going to do something in the future, just because President Biden says it, doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen that way. And I fear that we are not accurately, or sort of appropriately preparing for the future. The good news is I actually think, if anything, though, what's happening should make the United States more prepared to shift to Asia. I mean, one is, and this is a condition, we'll see how this all pans out and how the Russians behave. But if anything, they appear to be less formidable than we might have anticipated. Again, I caveat that. But more significantly, the Europeans, and particularly the Germans, are finally stepping up. And this is the missing ingredient for my strategy. And I really was very pointed about the Germans, and I have been very pointed to them in German in a series of articles over the years. My most recent one was in Süddeutsche Zeitung, the weekend of Munich Security Conference, saying, kind of lambasting them. But they stepped up, which I applaud. Now the question will be, are they going to stick with it and spend it on the right things? But I think we have a model here that could take us in the right direction, but I'm worried that we're not going in that direction. So with that, I think I've hit my 20 minutes actually exactly. So look forward to your questions, Helen, and from the audience as well.
That's great. Thanks very much, Elbridge. Can I start in a way with a bit of a historical question, just to tease something out in your argument, which is the end of the unipolar moment? When do you see the unipolar moment running to, and what do you think brings it to an end? And how important is your analysis of that to the judgment that you then make about where American strategic priorities need to be?
Well, I would say, personally, I always was, I was younger, but skeptical of the unipolar idea. So in a sense, it's a bit of a rhetorical trope, but it reacts to the dominant mindset in American policymaking circles from, I would say, 1991 for sure, maybe even 1989, until probably the financial crisis. I would say that the combination of the financial crisis and the sort of disastrous sort of unfolding, disastrous might be a little strong, but exceptionally disappointing results of the wars in the Middle East, really contributing to a slowdown or kind of perceptions of diminished American power. And then in the context of the financial crisis in particular, real headwinds for American economic growth, which is of course the ultimate source of our power. So I would say, I personally would have been more into husbanding our power during unipolarity, or perceptions of when we had unipolarity, but I think that was certainly the dominant mindset. And then I would say it's not just about us; it's mostly, as I use this in the preface, Napoleon is supposed to have said, but whether he said it or not doesn't matter. Xi Jinping quotes it, which is the line that when China wakes up, the world will shake. So that's the main factor that's been introduced into the international system, is the emergence of a sort of Jupiter-sized element into global politics, which was not the case, because our share, strictly speaking, our share of global GDP 30 years ago, 25 years ago, was not radically different than what it is today. I would say it's the combination of the single new pole rising, and actually probably a lot of it is our traditional allies who weren't always aligned with us, but more or less declining. So particularly Europe and Japan. The G7 is a much smaller fraction of global GDP than it was, and that share is going to continue to decline.
Yeah, because what struck me when you were talking was that a lot of it, what your starting place was an economic one, and that really China's strength comes from its economy. The United States' inability to do multiple fronts comes from the United States' relative economic decline in terms of share of the world GDP. But it seems to me there's another way of looking at it, which would be to say, actually, in a number of ways since 2008 at least, is that the United States has more financial power than it previously did. That China has certain economic problems in the post-2008 world, particularly on the monetary and financial side, that weren't there for it previously. So how much of what changes do you think in terms of perceptions of China's importance is the interaction between China's economic development and the capacity of that economic development, particularly in high-tech manufacturing, to have profound security geopolitical implications? So how important, in the judgment that you've come to, would be China's Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025 strategy from 2015?
Well, ultimately, the sources, I think, of power in the modern world are economic. It's economic productivity that's able to be translated into various forms of leverage, but above all, military power. So I have a kind of I would say, sort of I don't know if mixed or integrated view, which is, I actually don't think economic weapons are particularly effective relative to, things that kill people, but you have to use money to buy things that kill people, right? And that's where, the market exchange and PPP comes into relevance, because, for instance, the Russians are able to translate more of their own economic base into military power for a variety of reasons. So, I don't think, just to your question about Made in China 2025, that's important because that's at the forefront of human economic development. In some sense, who's at the top will really matter. But what I'm concerned about is that China will be a very, very large economy, even if it's less developed than we are, because of scale, and is already competing with us in some areas, according to the Eric Schmidts of the world, who seem to know about this, and that the stakes of the competition, the rivalry, are actually mostly geoeconomic in nature. But at least notionally, the war aims of Germany in the World War I were geoeconomic, German customs union, and the war aims of Japan in 1941 or 42, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, were also geoeconomic. So the stakes are geoeconomic in the sense of a sort of an ascendant kind of controlling position over a very large portion and growing portion of the global economy, and having a kind of gatekeeper role, a regulator role. I always find it a little ridiculous, but Alexander Stubb, the Finnish former prime minister, talks about Europe as a regulatory superpower. Well, what would be a regulatory superpower would be a China that controls but has a kind of decisive influence over upwards of 50% of global GDP, and says, well, if you want to play in our system, in this broad area, you have to comply. And that's going to be a dominant power. unless we're really, really well netted together, which we clearly aren't, at least across the transatlantic relationship. But geoeconomic stakes and goals can be pursued through military means, and that's what I'm worried about. That's why the military piece is so important. And often I find it kind of people, not you, of course, but people trip up on that. Just because the stakes and what's the source of power is economic doesn't mean that you can't pursue them with military means.
Yeah, another thought that I had as you were talking was the way in which China seems not to think perhaps in economic terms anyway, at least since 2013 and the Belt and Road strategy of dividing up Eurasia between the European part and the Asian part in economic terms. It looks like it has a Eurasian economic strategy and that it wants supply chains and markets that integrate the two sides of Eurasia. So if that's correct, how do you fit that into your position where the United States has to choose between dealing with China in Asia and dealing with Russia in Europe, and if China has got Eurasian ambitions rather than just Asian ambitions?
It does, but the key theater, the key prize is Asia. I mean, Churchill said, if we get things right in the decisive theater, we can put everything else right again. And China's power is going to tend to attenuate the farther it gets out, just geographically. And certainly that's true militarily, but also I think economically, it's going to find it difficult to exercise the kind of, because I think the key thing that I'm talking about is China's end goal is not just a sort of, Jiang Zemin friendly-ish, hey, we're just trying to get rich all together here, which it could have tentacles into Europe and trade, and not ask for anything more, and that would be fine. Essentially, that's actually a success. That's it, because I'm not looking to contain China or suppress China. I'm actually sort of the Jiang Zemin or even maybe a Deng Xiaoping kind of model is actually what I think success is, which is China is one of the two poles of the international environment, is very rich, has a lot of influence, but is not dominant. The question is, how does China turn the kind of influence that you're talking about into decisive political outcomes? And what we've seen in the last couple of years, Australia is a very obvious example, which is highly dependent on exports to the Chinese market. But actually, there was an article in the Journal a month or two ago about how the Chinese are even having difficulty translating leverage in like Kenya and other developing markets into decisive political outcomes, meaning to say, like, you are part of our sort of area, and you will basically disaffiliate from relations with the United States, and you will use, over time, you will use our currency, you will abide by our regulatory frameworks, and you won't buck our will. And that the problem that they're dealing with is like, Sri Lanka, they buy off one government, but then another government. This is what's happening in Kenya, right? So if this is the case, I think what ultimately China needs to be able to assemble that kind of soft imperial control is decisive, coercive leverage. And that's where the military piece really comes in, because Belt and Road, if anything, I don't think they haven't gotten countries to fundamentally change their political orientations through Belt and Road. They can influence, but they're always dealing with the back and forth, which is actually fine by us. If they really want countries to do something that they don't want to do, they need to be able to pose, in my view, a direct military threat. And this is the military they're actually building. And if they want to do that, then they have to be able basically to project power outwards. And they're kind of boxed in. And the most of the wealth that they're thinking about is actually concentrated in Asia. The periphery of maritime Asia is one of the most highly developed and dynamic areas in the world, right? And actually increasingly South and Southeast Asia, of course. So I think that's going to be the central theater. I think what they're doing with Europe is obviously they want to, help develop their economy. But I also think they're trying to, sort of not divide and conquer, but kind of just divide, right? Have serious sources of economic leverage where they can inhibit Europe from coming together in a cohesive way and make a difference in the competition, in the rivalry with the United States. So I think most of this is going to be about the Asian countries, and in Asia, the Europeans are going to play largely a secondary role.
How do you see that in terms of individual Asian countries? Because obviously, for fairly obvious reasons, there's a focus on Taiwan and what China sees as territorial unification there. Where do you think the vulnerabilities beyond Taiwan Or
Well, it's very vulnerable. So, I mean, the first island chain, people say, well, Taiwan's 100 miles from China. Well, the island of Luzon, the main island in the Philippine archipelago, is 100 miles from Taiwan. So, if Taiwan became Chinese, the Philippines would be directly vulnerable. And the Philippines is not very important as an economic actor, certainly not a high level of development, but it's very important from a geographic and military point of view. South Korea is 100 miles from the Chinese, from the Qingdao Peninsula in northeastern China, east of Beijing. And Japan is not very, Japan is a sort of equivalent strategically a bit to, not quite as exposed, but to West Germany in the Cold War, and India. So, I mean, the two pillars of the regional coalition, anti-hegemonic coalition, naturally is the two secondary powers are Japan and India. So it's going to be the US, Japan, India as sort of the cornerstones, and Australia punches a lot above its weight, but is a much smaller actor. So, in some ways we're doing okay. The Quad and things like that are great. But the problem is that the Chinese have been developing not only the economic leverage that you're talking about, but immense military capability. And if they're going to be able in this decade to be able to project potentially decisive military power, not only against Taiwan, but against the Philippines, against other countries in Southeast Asia, and if we're not careful, even against parts of the Japanese archipelago. And so we're way behind. The Japanese need to be doing much more. The Taiwanese need to be doing much more. The Indians are trying, but to the point that we were talking about before, despite many decades of prognoses that the Indians would be, surpass the Chinese, that has not happened. And generally, actually, when I talk to Indian officials and experts, they tend to have a pretty sober view of India's power differential vis-a-vis China. But I mean, I think this gives actually the India situation gives a good example. If India, I mean, in my mindset, India and Japan are the most important relationships the United States will have in the future, and yet India is getting castigated for its position on the Russia issue. And I mean, I would hope that India would support condemning Russia over Ukraine. But the question is, are we going to risk alienating India over something that's happening in Europe? I don't think that's wise. Instead, I think we should try to look at things in a more theater kind of perspective.
If we move to Russia now, what's your story, Elbridge, about Russia and the end of unipolarity and the emergence of a potentially multipolar world? What do you think the decisive junctures are there?
Well, and I've said this to the Russians over the years, I think they're mistaken if they think there's going to be a multipolar world. And frankly, they may be running into that right now. I think we're going to have a largely bipolar world that has features of multipolarity. And I think actually we're seeing Russia probably, unless there's a fundamental change in leadership, being driven into more and more into China's shadow, right? Which is that, Russia doesn't have the power base to pursue even to pursue the conquest of Ukraine, let alone attack NATO Europe. So, I mean, barring a fundamental shift in Russian policy, which I think we should hope for and try to induce if possible, but until that time, Russia's now in a position where it has no choice. Well, or it has a choice, but it's basically putting itself under China's, shadow, thumb, perhaps. I mean, they're completely dependent on China going forward. And it looks to me like and you would know more about this than I, but looks to me that we're beginning to see the outlines of an alternative geoeconomic bloc. I think it strikes me that the Chinese aren't ready for it, for the role of yuan that would be necessary and so forth. But, the fact that the Saudis are potentially are selling some of their oil in yuan, and the Indians are continuing to buy Russian oil, and the fact that a lot of the sanctions are highly concentrated in Europe and the North Atlantic area. Some of the larger emerging economies are not going along with them or going along with them the same degree as we are. And so this is probably going to be, I mean, I don't think those blocks are going to be impermeable. They're going to integrate across the barrier, if you will. But I think that seems to be what we're beginning to see.
But isn't that an argument for saying that Russia's in a stronger position, not militarily than we might have thought, but economically and in energy terms than we might have thought? Because on the one hand, we have the European countries who can't actually take energy sanctions against Russia because they're far too dependent. And the Asian market's become much more significant for Russia over the last decades or so, and it's not just China, it's India, you say too, and that they don't want to move. They're not willing to take essentially the Western side over this. And then if we look at the inability of the European countries, I would say for some understandable reasons, to pursue energy sanctions, doesn't that actually leave Russia in a stronger position? I mean, it might not be able to take Kyiv, but it's still going to end up with more territory than it started this war with, I would have thought, under most scenarios in which this war comes to an end. And what the crisis has demonstrated is that China and India, in particular, in energy terms, need Russia, and they're not going to give up on Russia.
Well, I mean, I think, look, I think we have to look at things in a more differentiated way. So India is going to continue its relationship with Russia, but has highly adversarial relations with China now. And I mean, the US and India have a fundamentally profound alignment of interest in our shared fear of China and China dominating Asia. So, I mean, for many years, I think one of the problems in the transatlantic relationship and discussion and the way the US deals with Europe, and particularly this administration, is that there's a tendency to want to kind of globalize all of our alliance relationships so that everybody will see things the same way. And I think, look at the Israelis. I mean, a very close US ally, different view on Russia, different view on the Middle East. To me, that's not a huge problem, right? What do we want? Israel is a relatively small actor. It's focused on the Middle East. Our perspective should be, how do we work with them in this area that's important to us, but is only one part of the global picture? Ditto with India. Asia is the primary theater. India is a key actor. Okay, they might not agree with us in Europe. Frankly, the Europeans, the Germans and the French wanted to sign the CAT with the Chinese. That was a really negative phenomenon for us, right? But okay, the Germans and the French, they need to come out of the COVID economy. All right, how do we look at this? So it's a kind of a more differentiated way that's based on this prioritization and what we can reasonably expect from our allies. I think with respect to the Russians and what you're saying, I don't want to say that the Russians are a basket case or that they have no leverage. They do. But I would say, I think it's a fault of ours, and it's certainly a fault of the Kremlin that they've reached this position, because I think Russia would be better off if it, just even look at it from pure geopolitical point of view. Well, if it had a kind of negotiating position where it could command more or less, more from both sides, where it was negotiating its position between China and the United States, basically. Whereas now it's basically completely pushed itself into a corner with the Chinese. So now, we're not going to give them a good deal to kind of, put some distance with China. And now China knows that they don't have an alternative. So China's going to drive a hard bargain with the Russians. So I don't think the Russians are in a very good position, even outside of their, from their point of view, disappointing performance in Ukraine.
Just one last question for me, Elbridge, which is about European capacity in all this. You're quite optimistic and pointing to the change in the German position, and in many ways, 50 years of German Ostpolitik has collapsed over the last few weeks. We're hearing very different language out of Berlin. But how quickly can Germany turn into a power that can take the lead in containing Russia in Europe?
Well, I hope quickly. I think if the Germans put their mind to something, they're capable of a great deal. So I don't think we should be letting them off the hook, And, the United Kingdom increased its defense spending in the middle of the pandemic to above 2%, I think. It was a commendable effort. So, the Bundeswehr, the West German military in the 1980s, was by far, as I understand it, the most capable military in NATO, other than that of the United States itself. So well within living memory, they've had a very, very sophisticated, capable military. So, this is a country that can do wonders very quickly. How long did it take them to, recover from the devastation of the war? Probably, not fully, but a matter of a decade. I don't know. I think they could put together a serious military in a few years if they really put their mind to it. And I think that's the standard we should hold them to.
Okay. We've got quite a few questions that have come in, so I'm going to turn to those now, Elbridge. The first is from Brendan Sims. There may actually be a number from Brendan. I'm going to start with this one. The book was written before the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and yet it was in some ways prefigured. In some way prefigured in it. I'm sure the syntax gone a bit wrong there. Do you approve of the withdrawal? And what impact do you think it has had on great power conflict?
Sure. I mean, just to be clear, I mean, a lot in my book, I have sort of specific policy views on a number of particular decisions, but I think somebody could use the framework of my book and come to different specific conclusions, even on as fundamental issues as like whether to defend Taiwan. You could probably, based on the military balance, you might reason, and especially going forward, you might reasonably assess that it's just too costly. And the Afghanistan withdrawal decision, I mean, certainly, I don't think you could use the framework of my book and decide that we should triple down in Afghanistan. But, you know, if you thought, well, we should try to keep a minimum force there, you know, that would actually lead to less exposure, et cetera. That's a position that's consistent with the logic of my book. My view is that that was not a realistic position because once the Taliban concluded that the Americans were not going to withdraw, they were going to increase attacks, which would have required an escalation again on our part. So I did favor the withdrawal. I think it's perfectly fair, and I'm generally allergic to accusations of incompetence because I think it tends to be a cheap critique. But on this one, I think it's pretty disastrously handled withdrawal. I mean, just by the fact that like they were obviously totally surprised by the collapse of, I mean, many of the White House officials and so forth were going on vacation in August. So they were clearly caught with their, excuse the expression, pants down. So, I mean, I think that my sense with the withdrawal from Afghanistan was, and I go into this concept, the differentiated credibility in the book. It's not so much that countries think that we're not going to defend them if they're our ally. I mean, for instance, I don't think there's been any impact on Japanese perceptions of US reliability or something. What I do think it did, and this is where I think it came into play in Ukraine, and again, this is speculation, I don't know, is perceptions of the competence and sort of efficacy and sort of general intimidationness of frankly, I think, I mean, not to be partisan, but the current administration. I think it reflected quite poorly on them. And I think that has, you know, left a pretty strong impression. But again, I don't know why Putin decided to go when he did, but he decided to go, you know, a year and several months into this administration. That's not by accident.
Okay. I have a question from David Cowan. What do you think were the Trump administration's achievements in moving the United States towards a strategy of denial?
Well, I think by far the most significant thing that the Trump administration did I mean, possibly period, but certainly in the realm of international affairs, was recognizing that China was clearly a threat, stating it as such, and then recognizing that there needed to be confrontation with China. Now, there were different views about the extent and nature of that confrontation, but that, because the Obama administration, people talk about the pivot to Asia of like the early 2010s, but it was kind of a paper exercise. It was largely engineered, I think, to his credit, by Kirk Campbell, and he deserves applause for trying. But it was sort of this like ethereal kind of thing that Asia's important, so we're going to do some more stuff there. And that's may have been what the market would bear at the time. Very little really changed in how America, and Kurt, I think, would admit this, at least when he's not in office. But I think, the Trump administration went well beyond this to say, look, this is, yes, Asia is essential, but also like China is by far our biggest problem, and we need to fundamentally change how we're doing business. And of course, the tariffs were part of that, but also the military strategy, the national defense strategy you mentioned, Helen said the same thing. And on denial, I would say that we were very much moving in the right direction, not as far as I would hope, but you had progress in the military services, but and the sort of Pentagon at large to be able to meet this kind of criterion. But the way I think about it is that the 2018 National Defense Strategy, when people ask me how thoroughly or how well has it been implemented, and I say, well, compared to other Pentagon strategies, quite well, but compared to what the strategic environment requires, not well, because we're not racing against ourselves, we're racing against China. And now I'm worried with the new Pentagon National Defense Strategy and with this renewed focus on Europe that we may fall farther behind the standard when the Chinese are continuing to gallop ahead.
Okay, we have a question from Scott Malcolmson here. What should be the US policy in Asia for countries that are not really allies? Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore. These are battleground states from China's point of view. What should the United States or its actual allies be doing in these theaters?
So this is a point about which I was acutely sensitive. Actually, it kind of irritated me because there was a capsule review in Foreign Affairs that sort of accused me of being obtuse to the fact that most countries don't want to pick a side. And actually, that's like a central theme of my whole point is I go through the countries of Asia individually and say which ones we should make more of an effort in terms of our defense alliances and kind of really working with. And a big part of my whole point is we should work with countries that are important, but also that are willing, to pull their weight and willing to work with us. And that tends to be, obviously those countries that already have alliances with us, as well as more, countries like Vietnam that are directly facing, and India, of course, that are directly facing a threat from China. Those are the ones that are most likely to go along with us, and not to overpressurize or over-expect the Malaysias or the Thailands, let alone Indonesia, because those countries are rationally going to want to keep trying to free ride. They are behind the kind of line of contact, if you will, between the U.S. and the Chinese kind of spheres, if you will. And so they're trying to keep their heads down and not get caught in the crossfire. So one of the reasons I'm in favor of defending Taiwan is because I think our alternatives, if we lose Taiwan and have to compensate, let alone the Philippines as well, to China's sphere, is that we're going to have to look at a series of bad options where we're going to be trying to convince countries that probably don't want to do it and they're located on the Asian mainland. So I think what we want to do with those countries for now is basically countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, is our interests is aligned, in my view, with the kind of ASEAN way, which is nationalism and autonomy and defending yourself. This is not John Foster Dulles. This is not everybody has to sign up to our Pactomania. This is, we want you to be able to defend yourselves from anybody. And that includes the PLA. So let's sell you anti-ship missiles and anti-air systems and, cyber resilience or whoever, get some, allies to sell them to you. So, that's sort of my mindset. But if we have Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Australia, India, in this kind of anti-hegemonic coalition, we're not going to have a formal alliance, I don't think, or I prefer not, with Vietnam or India. That actually is, that gives us a pretty darn good baseline. And, if the Chinese prove more aggressive and say, Vietnam wants to kind of become more actively involved, or even a Thailand decides to kind of say, okay, but let's not put ourselves in a position where we're relying on that because it's unlikely to pan out. I do think, though, that it's right to refer to Southeast Asia as the battleground. Unfortunately, hopefully not literally, but in a sense, that's because a lot of those countries are sort of unaffiliated. They naturally put themselves as the arena. If you're in the American defense perimeter, as we're seeing right now, you're generally going to be better off because, if you mess with South Korea, you mess with the Americans, right? But if you mess with Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, even Thailand, we have this kind of fake alliance. Burma, Malaysia, it's not, and the Chinese are much more intimidating than the Russians are, other than the larger nuclear arsenal, which the Chinese are now building up. So that's going to be, I actually think we could get to the point, if the Chinese continue growing in power and assertiveness, where a lot of countries are going to be knocking on our door, and we're going to have to be thinking to ourselves, do we really want to give security guarantees to countries on the Asian mainland? That has not gone well for us in general.
Okay, we have another question from Brendan, which is put very directly. Does the Ukraine conflict make you rethink your approach at all?
No, as I said in the book, the thing about that's sort of surprising to me, and I didn't the strategy is not based on Russia being a good guy. I don't think the Russians are good guys. I think Putin's obviously a very nasty character, right? And Russia hasn't gotten any stronger and China hasn't gotten any weaker. So, there's nothing, I look at it through what you might describe as sort of conventionally realist, lens. So what matters is power, and nothing has changed in the power situation. What could change my assessment is if the Chinese economy completely cratered, somehow, and wasn't recovering, that would change my assessment. That would sort of make me more sanguine in general, but that would be a fundamental shift. But the fact that Russia's being aggressive doesn't change it. I talk about a worse scenario in the book, which is an attack on NATO. And frankly, if anything, as I think I suggested earlier, the fact that the Russians are having such difficulty and the fact that the Europeans are stepping up suggests to me, I would do it anyway, even if they weren't, but all the more, reason for us to prioritize Asia, where active engagement is so critical.
Oh, if I push you a bit on that myself, is what then if it were a NATO country? What if it was one of the Baltic states?
Well, I think we should defend NATO, but my view is we need to withhold the critical military capabilities needed for an effective defense of Taiwan, even if Russia attacks NATO. Now, we should use whatever else we can to mount an effective defense of NATO, but we cannot put ourselves in a position where we can't defend Taiwan. And this is, we've shaped our military, and frankly, this has been a function most of the post-war period, where, you can't fight two very large wars under anything like concurrent timelines, right? We could fight, Grenada and China, maybe, like 1983 Grenada, but, we are simply not large enough, and we have not developed a military that's designed to fight two wars. And this gets particularly to scarcity, and I make this point frequently now, scarcity in kind of key systems. So people kind of say, oh, well, you could put the Army in Europe and the Air Force and the Navy in the Pacific. That's not how it works, right? American ground forces haven't been under direct enemy air attack since the Korean War. And that's not because of the Army, that's because of our Air Force or naval aviation, right? So we're gonna make sure we have air superiority. We're gonna make sure that we have enough munitions. We're gonna make sure we have the space assets. We're gonna make sure we have the attack submarines to go after, whoever's out there. And that's the problem. That's where we have scarcity. So my general view, as I focus in the book and what we worked on the national defense strategy, is we should focus on great powers preparing to fight. In the 2018 national defense strategy was China and then Russia. But the situation with China has gotten so much worse that my view is we've really got to just focus on China. And if we have stuff left over after nukes and counterterrorism, we can also do Europe. But there's this sort of sense that this is the kind of like an arcane, sort of pedantic kind of approach. And it's like, nope. I was, in the Battle of Britain, Churchill wanted to send, the Battle of France, Churchill wanted to send more Spitfires and Hurricanes, and Brendan would be the expert on this, to help the French, and Dowding said, no can do, because otherwise we can't defend the home islands. Or, the commander in Malaya, wanted more air cover, and for the ground forces there, but also for the naval flotilla down there. And they said, well, we needed an essential theater. Americans, even in World War II, when we were by far the largest economy in the world, we had a Europe first strategy, even though the Japanese attacked us first, because we knew it was going to take us time to produce the kind of the critical system, landing craft, these kinds of things. And we didn't always follow it, but notionally our strategy was Europe first. And so this is the kind of scenario that I think we need to be prepared for. The good news is I think the Russians are going to actually have difficulty mounting a direct conventional attack on NATO. So to your earlier point, Helen, let's get the Germans to actually step up and do their job. It's not just about the Americans. And, the Poles are increasing to 3%, which is great. The Romanians, there's a lot of capacity here. And if the Russians don't have a fait accompli ground attack option, I don't think they have a really serious theory of victory against NATO, because I don't think they're going to credibly be able to threaten nuclear escalation to get NATO to give up allied territory. I think nuclear escalation is more likely to be effective, and nobody really knows, but more likely to be effective in kind of like capturing gains that have already been made at the sub-nuclear level or sub-strategic nuclear level. And so if Russia can't do that, then it doesn't really have a theory of victory.
What about the Persian Gulf? Where do your view on that, particularly in relation to the fact that essentially America is providing naval energy security for Chinese imports of oil through the Persian Gulf? Does the United States still need to be doing that?
Well, we definitely shouldn't be helping the Chinese out. That's, I mean, you sometimes get this argument where people are like, well, the Chinese should be thankful for us, and like, no, that's crazy. Of course they're not going to be thankful for us. No, the Persian Gulf is a distant third in terms of importance. It's large. The Middle East itself is not that important. It's really the Gulf, because of the concentrated hydrocarbons. The economic activity of the area is relatively limited otherwise. I mean this from a geopolitical, obviously it's important that people live there, but from America's point of view. So we need to be doing a lot less. It's a distant third behind Asia, than Europe, than the Persian Gulf. And the other thing is militarily, if the Chinese basically can't break through the first island chain, then they're going to have real difficulty projecting and sustaining serious military power in the Middle East, because in theory they can do it over land, but that's way in the west and over the Himalayas. And of course the Indians are there, not to mention the Iranians, who I guess they have a friendly relationship with, but who knows. There's Pakistan, but then in order to supply military forces across the Himalayas and then down the length of Pakistan, that's a daunting logistical challenge that, by the way, can be readily cut by allied action in various ways. But if the Chinese break through the first island chain and then have power, naval, air, space, marine kind of army power projection, which they're building the capability to mount, then the Middle East will be determined. So again, this gets back to the Churchill line about, if we win decisive theater, we can put things right again. If we get things right in the first island chain, the Middle East is kind of taken care of. It might be messy, but we can put it right, eventually. But the reverse is not true. If we take care of the Middle East in the near term, but we neglect the first island chain, which is what's happening, then we don't help the first island chain, but ultimately we would lose in the Middle East too.
But would you actually press that to an argument for actual withdrawal from the Persian Gulf?
I would have a very limited sort of largely offshore American military presence, and I would outsource as much as possible to the kind of Abraham coalition. I mean, my view is similar to kind of like the Guam Doctrine approach. Again, not the sort of teetering giant kind of self-flagellating attitude of the 1970s, but more just like, let's look for regional, states that are powerful and willing to get in the fight, and then let's help them out. And instead of always trying to be the leader everywhere, well, let's say, hey, the Israelis and the Saudis and the Emiratis seem to be willing to work together. Okay, let's empower them. Well, we're not going to give them an atomic bomb, but let's sell them Patriot, and and I mean, the administration is doing the reverse, it's putting sanctions and slow rolling F-35 sales, and that gets into qualitative military edge, and which is complicated and important. But I, in general, I think we want to be looking at countries, again, like Germany and Poland, that are saying, all right, they've got capacity, increasingly they have the will. Great. India and South Asia. We should have a modest presence in South Asia, certainly militarily. We should basically be looking at backing the Indians up. And then we can focus our, not only, I mean, yes, military, but also our sort of diplomatic capital. As a friend of mine who's, he's been a senior government guy. He points out that, in the latter part of the Obama years, even when senior officials would go to Asia, they would be talking about the Middle East or Ebola or Crimea, and not talking about Asia. It should be the reverse. It should be when Tony Blinken goes to other regions, he's actually talking about Asia. He's talking about Taiwan, and he's talking about Japan, and he's talking about China's problems. And that's the kind of idea we want. It's not just like putting widgets and missiles and so forth in Asia. It's also about saying that's where we need to focus. This, again, the India thing is a really good example, because we should be ensuring everything is in place to propel our partnership with India and to support India. Because even if we have objections to some things that the Indians are doing, how does that match against our priorities? And we should be thinking in what's our priorities, which are, sort of resilient to spikes in the international environment, even dramatic and abominable from a moral perspective what Putin is doing, but it doesn't change the geopolitical landscape really.
Okay, we've gone through our hour. That's been an extremely enjoyable conversation, Elbridge, and thanks very much for presenting your arguments with such clarity and really engaging so directly with the question of what difference or not this moment makes. And you've made pretty clear what your answer to that is. it remains for me to thank Elbridge again and to thank you all for watching this, and hopefully we'll see you in the future at some future Centre for Geopolitics events.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks to the Center. Have a great evening.